Welcome. Welcome to the 2021 Citizens Climate Lobby Conference. If you're one of the people from the 50 states that are registered plus the District of Columbia, or the 20 countries outside the US, welcome to all of you. Also, if you're joining us, listening to the recording, thank you for being part of the 2021 conference. My name is Mark Reynolds. I'm Citizens Climate Lobby's Executive Director, and what I'm going to do is just give you a quick overview of what's going to be happening over the next 2 days. Then I'll be introducing our first keynote speaker, Jerry Taylor. So as I just said right there, Jerry Taylor will be our first keynote speaker. The next speakers after that will be Jasmine Sanders and Clara Fang, both of who are experts in engaging and recruiting young people. Their comments will start at 1:25. At 1:45, we'll be joined by our Vice President of Government Affairs, Dr. Danny Richter, who will give us a legislative update. There'll then be a break from 2 until 2:10. And at 2:10, there's the first set of two kinds of breakouts. The first set of breakouts is about who supports a carbon price. So maybe you want to hear from the perspective of labor. Maybe you want to hear from the perspective of environmental justice. Maybe you want to hear how mayors look at this. So the first set of breakouts, and you'll have 7 choices, is who supports a price on carbon. Then from 2:40 to 3:10, you have a choice. You could either take a break, or CCL has over 60 action teams that engage on different topic areas, and you could join, if you're a member of one of those action teams, your action team, or you could go find out about one. I recommend that you definitely take advantage of the action teams by joining and listening on one of those. From 3:10 to 3:40 is the next set of breakouts, and these breakouts are designed around what can you do. So maybe you want to improve your capacity to generate endorsements in your community. Maybe you think the best thing for you and your chapter would be working on your social media skills. So while the first set of breakouts were about who supports a carbon price, this is about what you can do. The next sessions will be from 3:50 to 4:35, and those will be with your with your states. And you can find your states, most of you, by going to the booths tab for the conference. California, you'll go to the schedule. For most states, you'll go to the booth tabs. In California, you'll go to the schedule. And then our last keynote will be Adele Morris from Brookings. That'll be from 4:40 to 5 o'clock. I don't think that there's a more highly regarded economist in Washington, D.C. than Adele Morris, so we're thrilled to be joined by her also. Okay, I don't know how many of you read everything that Niskanen writes and try and listen on everything they do, but I do. It seems to me that we're in a country, in a world where mostly what people do is have reactionary and emotional responses to the events and people around them. When you read what Niskanen publishes with Jerry and his team, you always get thoughtful, measured, well-conceived arguments. And so I just think that this is one of the organizations you want to be following. I think Jerry Taylor is one of the most important leaders on climate in this country. And we are really, really happy he could join us. He was our first choice for who we wanted to make sure was at this conference today. Jerry Taylor, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for your kind introduction. I'm here because I founded and am currently the president of the Niskanen Center, but most importantly, for 21 years, I worked at the Cato Institute on the other side of this debate. I have deep roots in the Republican Party and the libertarian conservative world. And my job, like much of your job, is to try to move the needles in Congress for those people who are not, who are climate curious, but not necessarily with us quite yet. And I really think the work at moving the Republican Party is really everything in the climate debate. It's absolutely everything. The only reason we don't have more ambitious climate policy is because of Republican opposition, full stop. So any political strategy that doesn't give me a story about how it's going to reduce the power of Republican opposition is a strategy, in my opinion, that's not worth very much. And we really need substantial Republican support to get where we want to go. First of all, there's not enough executive power at the EPA to unilaterally use regulatory authority to decarbonize on the pace that we need to progress. So we don't have the control switches in the executive branch to do this job. We need additional legislative support. And that legislative action needs to be sustainable. We have 30 years to largely decarbonize the United States economy. And that means even if we have a run of Democratic unified government, it doesn't do us much good if in 2028 or 2032, Republicans come into power and then rip it all out. So we need sustainable buy-in from the GOP because this is a long-term project. And raw partisan power simply isn't going to cut it. I mean, it's easy to fantasize about ideas where Democrats increase their numbers in the House and the Senate and just ram through their legislation, maybe gets rid of filibusters or something along those lines. But historically, that's just not how politics works. Political scientists James Curry and Francis Lee examine the legislative record for priority legislation that became law from 1973 to 2016. So they looked at a large swath of enacted priority pieces of legislation. And they found that only 4% of the time, 10 bills out of 254 that were passed over that period of time that qualified as priority legislation, did the majority party get most of what it wanted over the objections of most of the opposing party in both chambers of Congress, and without the endorsement of at least one elected party leader of the opposing party in either chamber. So the reality is trying to do this with raw Democratic political muscle is basically hoping for a lottery ticket to come in. So we need Republican support, or else we're not going to get to where we want to go. Now, I wish I could tell you a happy story about how the Republicans are poised to help us in that lift, but I can't. Right now, in the Republican Party, it's all culture war theater, unhinged conspiracy peddling, red baiting, white grievance politics, and performance art for cameras at OAN, Newsmax, and Fox News. Very few people in the Republican Party are interested in governing at all. And by that, I mean not just few people, very few legislators. If you look at the GOP platform in 2020, there was no platform in 2020. The Republican Party was not even interested in putting its name on any sort of policy initiative anywhere in the political spectrum. Just whatever Donald Trump told them to do, they promised that they would do. Even after the November elections, the very first meeting this year, the Conservative Political Action Conference, the famous CPAC gathering of conservative activists, found a 3 or 4 day agenda in which policy discussion was virtually non-existent. If you cared about Mr. Potato Head, yeah, you get a lot of discussion about culture war stuff and cancel culture, but virtually nothing about governance. So right now, the Republican Party is simply not a realistic vehicle to moving public policy on climate change, or actually public policy on virtually any issue whatsoever. Now, there are Republicans who are interested in promoting climate action. So I don't want to overstate the dire situation in the Republican Party, because there are members there who are climate curious. There's probably a dozen Republicans in the Senate and probably about 3 dozen or so, maybe 4 dozen or so Republicans in the House who have leaned forward towards or leaned into the case for climate action in the Republican Party. But they have not gone anywhere near as far as we'd like. They are looking for a political opportunity to act. They don't see that window of opportunity there. And they're also caught in the crosshairs of a party that believes that any aggressive move by the Biden administration to promote low carbon energy is akin to embracing AOC's Green New Deal. Now, a lot of the Republican leaders don't really believe that, but it's worked for them in the polls to tie the Democratic Party to policy extremism. AOC is the Joan of Arc of policy extremism in Republican eyes when it comes to that party, and her signature cause is the Green New Deal, and that's been a real problem for us. So what I'm trying to say is, if we want to see the Republican Party join us in the cause for climate action, we need to return the Republican Party to health. That is a prerequisite to having a reasonable political conversation in the GOP. So that means for climate activists like members of the Citizens Climate Lobby, I would suggest that maybe you broaden your horizons a bit and look at the broader issues in the Republican Party, because solving them is a prerequisite to moving the GOP in any meaningful fashion. Now, it's easy to be skeptical about the prospects for something like that, but let me offer some faint. Let me point out some faint traces of light at the end of the political tunnel in the GOP. First of all, The most important coalitional actor in the party is corporate America, always has been, always will be. But they have been temporarily relegated to the back seat of the car, while the red-hatted Trumpist MAGA crowd is in the front seat with the driver's wheel. But that is not a stable equilibrium. So you've increasingly seen corporate America moving distant from the GOP, definitely distant from Donald Trump, and they are one of the most important political actors in the Republican Party. And we also know that the corporate community, with only modest exception, is embracing climate action, ambitious climate action, carbon taxation in particular, and many of them are quite open to tax and dividend, which is, I know, the CCL cause. So the most important political constituency in the party is, at least aspirationally, with our cause. We also know that the establishment leadership in the House and the Senate is quite nervous about what's going on in the Republican Party. While Mitch McConnell has not put on the Braveheart face paint of never Trump, he's certainly in the crosshairs of Donald Trump, whether he likes it or not, every week or two. And his entire leadership team is likewise finding themselves in that position. And while Kevin McCarthy is a little bit more MAGA-oriented than Mitch McConnell, he has put together a couple of dozen Republicans in the House around him who have been introducing positive, if incremental, climate legislation. And so Kevin McCarthy, at least on the climate front, is a ally at a distance and potentially a greater ally down the road. So that's fairly encouraging. And about 30% of the rank and file of the Republican Party seems to be quite uncomfortable with Donald Trump. And they are still, and if you look at the surveys, even larger numbers of Republican-based voters are open to climate action, far more than is the case for their legislative representatives on the Hill. So it's not entirely a lost cause. We do have material to work with. I don't want to be Sally Sunshine here because I'd look foolish, because this is obviously a heavy lift and it's going to take some time. But we do have some material to work with in the Republican Party. One of the most important things that's going on in the GOP that gives me some degree of encouragement beyond that is the fact that the MAGA community, which dominates the party, has been cosplaying as the working class party. Now, of course, this is pretty thin gruel, given the fact that they become apoplectic over increases in corporate income taxes. The revelations this week that Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and a number of other billionaires pay virtually no taxes whatsoever has not exactly inflamed the working class, the avatars of the GOP. They have thrown their bodies in front of any idea of increasing taxes on the mega wealthy as well. And of course, they do nothing to deliver whatsoever to the working class of the Republican Party, and as far as their material well-being is concerned. So all of the economic angst, the dislocations in rural America, the lack of job opportunities, even the socio-cultural problems like the opioid epidemic goes utterly unaddressed by people like Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene and the rest of the MAGA community, which is more concerned about chasing conspiracies and offering big lies and whatnot than lifting a finger to help their alleged working class allies in the GOP, or the alleged working class base of the party. Now, there are a lot of working class Republicans, and I think that gives us an opportunity. And while I could go on a number of fronts where that might be, climate change is one of them. I mean, after all, as most of you know, a tax and dividend plan would end up benefiting 3/4 of the American people. It would provide net costs only to a subset, a minority of the American people, the wealthy. And the wealthy that would be largely hammered are the wealthy in blue state America. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why the Republicans may very well, or at least a working class party fired by the right sort of political leadership and campaign, may find themselves in a position saying, hey, look, we don't want to die on an altar here for ExxonMobil or the American Petroleum Institute. Decarbonization is not only good for the environment, and it's good for our children, and is good for working people, but it's also good for my paycheck, because I end up receiving more in the dividend that I pay in the tax. Now, when you talk to political analysts, they'll tell you that trying to sell that story is virtually impossible. but it has gotten political legs in the past, and it has succeeded in the past. Canada, just north of the border, is not all that different from the United States. It's as resource intensive an economy as the US economy. It's got just as large a fossil fuel foundation towards its economy. And yet it has adopted a relatively robust and meaningful carbon tax, not a perfect one, but one that is far better than we've seen anywhere else in the United States. And they've been able to sustain it with exactly that argument. So I don't think it's a lost cause, but what I do want to leave you with is two thoughts. One, short-term optimism that the Republican Party is poised to engage in a lift on carbon action, on climate action, given the current makeup of the party, is a nice thought, and I wish that argument well, but I don't see it. I think before that party is going to move in our direction and provide meaningful help, the party's going to have to change. But I see good reasons for why the party may end up changing, not only for the reasons I've just told you, but sooner or later, Republicans are going to discover that they cannot put together majorities in the Congress or win the White House without being able to recapture suburban votes, especially well-educated suburbanites who used to be the base of the Republican Party. And it's that community which is more animated about climate change than any other. So if you're trying to get those voters back into your camp, what are you going to do to bring them back to what they see as a toxic Arkham Asylum Republican Party? Are you going to throw the evangelical Christian community under the bus in that project? Probably not. They're very powerful in the party. Are you going to throw the NRA under the political bus to get those voters back? Well, that's a big lift as well. They're very powerful in the party. So climate change, while again, as an apostate consideration for most Republicans, does not have that much support within the coalitional actors of the Republican Party. Even Koch Industries, which is the political Koch network, which in the past has been very powerful, is moving away from engagement in partisan Republican politics, reducing their investments on that front. And Charles Koch is making increasingly frequent noises about the need to act in a market-friendly fashion to address climate change. So, and when you've got big oil and big gas now likewise endorsing carbon taxation and putting out good sounds with regards to tax and dividend, I think we have the makings here for what can be a sea change in the Republican approach towards climate. Also, given the fact that this is a party that is the representative of business for the most part. And as the energy industry moves from brown to green, which is happening whether we're taking action on carbon taxation or not, then increasingly to defend the energy industry is to defend the green economy. And I do think that you're already seeing a little bit of that in the GOP. I think we're going to start seeing more of it as the green energy revolution progresses. So it does gives us hope, but it does require patience and it requires savvy political strategy. And I can't be more pleased than to talk about these matters with you and Mark Reynolds and the CCL team, because as far as patience and political savvy, CCL has a lot of it. And I thank you for throwing in with them in this cause and for joining in the fight. Thank you.
You about the Frank Luntz polling that shows a lot of support among young conservatives for action on climate change and in particular for carbon pricing. Can you speak to that and say how much you think that helps or doesn't help?
Well, I think it very much helps. Republicans are very aware of the fact that young voters are turning away from the Republican Party in droves right now. And it doesn't have to be that way. When I was in college, it was the Reagan presidency and conservatives outnumbered liberals on campus, or at least pro-Reagan outnumbered anti-Reagan forces in the school I attended in a lot of parts of America. So if, as the baby boomers move off into retirement and the older Republican Fox News viewing community dies off, they're being replaced by millennials and Gen Xers, and they look at the Republicans on climate as absolutely insane, and the saliency of climate change amongst young voters is very high. Whereas even for most older voters, climate change is a lower tier issue. It's not that way for young people. They've been brought up fully aware of what we're cruising into and the dangers that are associated with climate change. And in fact, when you talk to the congressional members around Kevin McCarthy who are introducing positive climate legislation, albeit not sufficient climate legislation as far as ambition is concerned. You hear a lot of that conversation. We can't win without the suburbs. We can't win without vote. We can't lose everyone under 60 years old in the United States. And over time, if we don't do something about these problems, we're heading towards political extinction. So hearing more young conservative voices on climate change might be the most persuasive thing as far as moving some of the needles in the Republican House caucus.
Great. One thing I'd like you touched on it briefly, but you used to kind of be the front man for Cato of why climate change isn't happening. And most of us are really bad at admitting we got something wrong. It's like it's not most people's strong suit, certainly not mine. Just tell us, how did that process work of, one point something happened and you said, I'm on the wrong side of this?
Well, it didn't happen overnight. And as Upton Sinclair once said, it's awful hard to convince someone to change their mind when their entire paychecks and livelihood depends on them not changing their mind. And that's where I was at the Cato Institute. To embrace mainstream climate science and mainstream climate economics was essentially to resign. So those were my choices: continue working there, resigning. And so when David Hume once said, reason is a slave of the passions. And for a libertarian, passions run against government, against intervention in the economy, against embrace of people like Naomi Klein, who is, who wrote a book called This Changes Everything, in which she argued that if you accept climate change and mainstream climate science, you're going to have to throw capitalism under the bus in toto. Now, I don't believe that for a moment, but when people like Naomi Klein say that, it's easy for people like me and my old community of libertarians to have their hair stand straight up to say, oh my gosh, this is exactly the ballgame. So my mind changed, but it didn't happen overnight. It was a sequence of events, and not to spend the rest of your entire conference going through it. First, I lost faith in the scientific narratives the climate skeptics were offering. Then I lost faith in the economic narratives that climate skeptics were offering, in saying that the costs of decarbonization are greater than the costs of climate change. There used to be economists who'd make that argument, including Bill Nordhaus at Yale. Recently won a Nobel Prize for his work on climate economics. But by the time of the mid to late 2000s came around, I found myself at Cato literally unable to find a single credentialed economist in academia who published in the peer-reviewed literature on climate economics, who argued again on a cost-benefit basis against a carbon tax. Couldn't find a single one. Oh, I could find somebody who was the chair of the free enterprise department at Appalachian State College who never published a peer-reviewed article in his life on the topic and wanted to pop off at a Heritage Foundation conference. But I couldn't find real credentialed economists to make those arguments who could pass a peer review. So, it was in the course of time that I just found myself completely having lost faith in the skeptics' narrative. But the one advantage it provides me is that when I talk to members of Congress or their senior staff, I can say, look, I know full well why you're skeptical about throwing in with climate activism or a carbon tax. I was in the same shoes you were for 20 odd years. I mean, the talking points you're offering here are the points I wrote. I mean, and I believe them. I mean, I wasn't doing it just for the cash. I was a good faith opponent, just like you are. But let me tell you why I changed my mind and why it didn't require me to shotgun my faith in Milton Friedman or Friedrich Hayek or free market economics or anything of the kind. And that gives me, and the Niskanen Center, kind of a unique advantage in some of these conversations, I think.
Yeah, it definitely does. Jerry Taylor, thank you so much for making yourself available. It's the second keynote you've given for us for a national conference. You've been a guest on our monthly call. You've been a guest of our regional conferences. You're such an ally and resource. Really, really appreciate it. And thank you again.
Well, thank you. I'm a tremendous fan of CCL and what you're doing, Mark, and anything we can ever do to help, we're always here. Thank you. And thank you, for one of the audience, for your work.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And if for anybody who's annoyed about emojis coming up on the screen, I have no control over that. So I'm sorry if the emojis bother you, but that's not something that I can actually control. I do want to remind you a couple things about AirMeet. If you look at the schedule and you click Remind Me, what that will do is put that in your schedule and will remind you of that session. Again, the state sessions can be reached through the booths, and except for California, which is in the schedule, and then the help desk is in the lounge. Our next two speakers are Clara Fang, CCL's Director of Student Engagement, and Jasmine Saunders from our Climate, both of whom know a lot about engaging young people, and really excited to have the two of you join us. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Mark. It's so wonderful to be here. So I'm Clara Fang, and I'm CCL Student Engagement Director. For the last 4 years, CCL has been intentionally engaging young people on climate advocacy. Since January 2020, in the pandemic, we have had over 1,000 applicants for our internships, 53 campus leaders, and 990 young people join us for our climate advocacy certificate program. Our youth and higher ed programs continue to be a vibrant area of advocacy and outreach. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Jasmine Sanders, the Executive Director of Our Climate, to a conversation about youth and climate action. Our Climate is a climate change advocacy organization energized by its youth grassroots movement. Striving to raise awareness to the intersecting effects of climate change and the communities of color who are disproportionately affected, Jasmine utilizes the positivity that results from uplifting our youth to make a global impact. Previously, she managed strategic initiatives and special projects for HIAS, an international refugee rights protection agency. She was recently featured in a CNBC article entitled 6 Black Climate Change Leaders You Need to Know, alongside Dr. Robert Bullard, father of the environmental justice movement. Jasmine holds a Master of Science in Tropical Marine Biology from University of Essex and is a graduate of University of South Alabama with a BS in Biology and a minor in Spanish. So welcome, Jasmine.
Hi, Clara. How are you doing?
Great, it's good to see you.
Good to see you as well. Thank you for having me today.
Absolutely. Our Climate has been a wonderful partner with CCL and inspired a lot of our own youth initiatives. It started in 2016 as Oregon Climate with a mission to engage young people on science-based equitable climate policy, and you became the executive director last summer. So can you tell us about how the organization is situated in the climate movement and what you are working on these days?
Yeah. So some people actually don't know this, but Our Climate started off as Oregon Climate in 2013 as a statewide campaign. And it wasn't until 2016 that we actually became this national organization. And it was artwork that started our movement, which is a powerful medium that inspires multiple generations. It uplifts the voices of young people, leaves room for interpretation, and it opens the door for conversation with elected officials. When the organization transitioned into the national organization in 2016, it had grown. It had grown its youth grassroots movement. And I like to describe the climate justice movement as an ecosystem. Ecosystems are defined as biological communities of interacting organisms and their physical environment. It's also known as a complex network or interconnected system. So the climate justice ecosystem is made up of a variety of organizations, which can be divided into youth, adult allies, and then you have a few that are like a mix. But then there's also the different niches that each organization specializes in. OC advocates for science-based and equitable climate policy rooted in 3 areas: corporate polluter fees, environmental justice legislation, and renewable energy targets. These days, we've been busy affecting state and federal level policy. Our student leaders in the Pacific Northwest, namely Oregon and Washington, passed a monumental 16 state level policies this past session. That is amazing. If you think to the history of in Oregon and in Washington, we haven't really been able to pass that many, but we did know with the previous administration's lack of desire to want to dive into the environmental and into science, we really started to focus back on our state level policy. And so this was a celebration that we've been having. Our fellows graduated last month, and we were very proud to have a group of 28 fellows who graduated from each of our target state programs. So we're in Washington, Oregon, New York, Massachusetts, and Florida, along with our national programming. We're busy on the federal level, advocating for the Environmental Justice for All Act, the Justice for Black Farmers Act, and more. We recently worked with Congresswoman Yvette D. Clarke of New York and staff on the Climate Justice Act, which was recently introduced and is the federal level model of New York's CLCPA that we helped pass. In 2021, we have held 79 events and trainings to spread awareness about climate justice and empower the next generation of climate leaders. We've trained over 1,500 young leaders become powerful advocates for equitable science-based climate policy in their communities. And we've connected with elected officials through grassroots organizing and lobby days. One of the key skill sets we teach at OC is storytelling. I'm thinking back to Jerry's remarks, and it brings me back to the larger message. Climate change is a global human issue. It affects each and every one of us at some level, and for some of us in multiple ways. And I'll speak more on that later, but as you mentioned, Clara, my personal passion is raising awareness to the disproportionate impacts of the intersectional complexity of climate change on communities of color. I do this through storytelling, whether it's a speaking event or my writing. It's just a personal passion of mine and from my roots in Louisiana and seeing my home state disappear. At Our Climate, it's about connecting our young student leaders to climate change professionals. We recently released our podcast, Is It Hot Enough For You, on Spotify. The podcast is important because it's bringing this subject matter that we all know about and talking about activism, the disproportionate impacts of climate change, and humanizing the issue. But more importantly, it's making the subject relatable, bringing the conversation into your home. Even though majority of Americans know that climate change is happening, only approximately 40% are having the conversation at the dinner table. So this is why at OC, we want to make the subject relatable. We want to break down the information. And this is why I also make my personal social media content about that. We have to bring this subject matter to the dinner table, at happy hour, to our family picnics and our barbecues.
Yes, absolutely. Wow, it's so impressive the impact that you and your young leaders have been able to have, and just really appreciate the way that you've modeled that for us. So can you tell us what you think are the elements of good climate carbon pricing policy?
Yeah, so I was trying to condense my answer to this because carbon pricing, or as we call it now at OC, corporate polluter fees, I think it's such a complex matter. And one of the things that you see is that there's this this breakdown of knowledge. People can hear the word carbon pricing or corporate polluter fees, and they're like, whoa, what is that? So at OC, we advocate for strong, specific corporate polluter fees to equitably fund a just transition. Important elements that come to mind for me are the prices have to be high and they need to increase each year until we reach our emissions targets. This would cover all sectors of the economy. It would be applied to all greenhouse gases, including those generated by extraction and transports of fuels. Secondly, we have to directly invest into our frontline communities. Frontline communities are communities of color, low-income communities, coastal communities. These are the ones who have been the most impacted by climate change thus far. And third, I would say the rest should be spent on some combination of the following, from green infrastructure to worker protection, creating a council of decision makers who will decide how funding should be allocated and spent. For me, for OC, these are our core principles when it comes to corporate polluter fees and the elements that should be included.
Wonderful. It's really interesting that reframing to corporate polluter fees. I live in Detroit, and in our chapter, we've been talking a lot about how we can talk about carbon pricing in a way to environmental justice community. So that's a good thing for us to learn from. Right. So in your work with young people, what do you notice? What are young people excited about when it comes to climate action?
Yeah. One, I would say young people don't take the answer no. Instead, they're some of the best craftsmen to finding alternative ways to reach you. I like to say that OC is the catalyst for young people becoming visionaries, activists, and leaders in their own communities. When it comes to climate action, young people very much resemble the civil rights activists. They're wanting to showcase the intersectionality of the issue. It's indeed the circle of life, not just having the environmental and financial impacts, but it also affects migration flows, food insecurity, housing, racial dynamics, and sociocultural tension. These are all siloed issues, yet they're interconnected, and climate change only exacerbates the existing stressors and societal inequities. This is why our young people are advocating for a holistic approach to climate action and science-based equitable climate policy solutions. And one direct example of that is how at OC we've started to really hone in on listening sessions. Our field team in Massachusetts held listening sessions with some communities and our EJ partners to chat about carbon pricing and what does that look like equitably. And through that conversation, we got some direct examples of how you could actually directly invest back into frontline communities. We got how there needs to be a development of resources. People take in information a variety of ways. And so we have to make sure those of us who are working on this policy and the advocates that we are uplifting are able to receive the information and disseminate the information in multiple ways.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. In my work with the youth at CCL, I also noticed just, first of all, that there is tremendous interest from them from all walks of life and avenues of study, and environmental justice is really important. As you say, that climate change is connected to racial justice and economic justice and public health, all these issues that young people are concerned about. Another aspect that I work on is helping them to customize their experience and giving them a lot of autonomy, using the work that we do as a career development experience and in networking and community building. So I'm wondering if any of those are things that you work on at our climate as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a great thing, because when you're engaging students and young people, you are wanting to really connect with them. You're wanting to make sure that you are passing down your knowledge and sharing with them. So in OC's leadership development program, we not only are trying to develop leaders and give them the skill sets to advocate for equitable climate policy solutions, but it's also developing them as professionals. This is why, if you're one of our fellows, we encourage you to attend an additional professional or educational training experience, and then for us to be able to reimburse you. Secondly, we have our fellows participate in an external committee or project on a weekly basis. So we have our fellows in New York, and they represent us on several of the committees: steering committee, policy committee, the youth committee. In New York Renews, which is the statewide coalition. Renew Oregon, we sit on the policy table and the mental health table. These are just some of the ways how we're involved, OC particularly, in our student leaders, getting them involved on the professional level. Networking is something that anyone and everyone is going to need. You have to put work into who you are going to be. It's not just your upbringing, it's what are you bringing to the table? How are you making sure that you are putting your name out there? I like to tell people, if you don't advocate for yourself, nobody else is. So we want to introduce them into what are those like networking skills? Who are the people that you can talk to? Representation is another key matter for people. They want to be able to see someone and they can identify with them. And this is across a wide variety of, demographics. And we're also making sure that that they stay engaged with us even after they finish their fellowship program or are a field advisor with us. So we've created a new group on LinkedIn. It's through our OC page, and you're invited if you are an alumni of the program. But this is where we share job opportunities with them. We always get notices from our partners, such as yourselves, about new jobs, and our student leaders would be great for that. So I think it's important for CCL and OC and others to continue to provide these opportunities for our youth.
Great, those are really empowering opportunities. And at CCL, we strive to offer it as well through our Campus Leaders program and our fellowship program, where we pay students to help us do advocacy and outreach and provide them with opportunities to work with a range of organizations and practice their advocacy skills and to organize in their community. So my next question is, what are the challenges in working with youth on climate change? And what strategies do you find successful in keeping them engaged?
Great question. I don't per se see a challenge, but rather an opportunity in mentoring. Young people these days are dealing with the climate crisis, a global pandemic, racial unrest, and yes, still dealing with political uncertainty. In case you guys didn't know it, it's midterm elections next year. So we don't know what the House and the Senate are going to look like. Generation Z and millennials are some of the most knowledgeable individuals I know. They have this natural craving to constantly learn more, go after what they want, and they will mold and create something if they don't see the example of it. That's why you're seeing a lot of these go-getters and these entrepreneurs. Young people have taken engagement and activism to a whole other level. Each day, our student leaders, these are young people in high school and college, are showing the world that activism shows up a variety of ways. When I was growing up, it was simply just about, let me go to the dollar store and grab a poster and markers, and I'm going to be advocating for this matter and standing out with my parents. But nowadays, it looks so different. It can be that. It can also be you at a rally. It could be like our student leaders did across the nation. It was a climate hour spoken word. They create informational carousel posts. They create TikToks and IG reels. There are endless ways to keep them engaged and for them to tap into their creative wheelhouse. Each individual is different, yet wanting to tackle the climate crisis and revolutionize how we mitigate it.
Great. I love the way that you mentioned how art is such an important part of the advocacy. Are there some ways that our climate has been able to utilize that, or other strategies to keep young people engaged?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, our climate started off where it was student leaders and adult allies who came together, and they created these mosaic art tiles. And on the tiles, they were really telling the story of how climate change is impacting them, their communities. What does it mean to them? And so they walked to the Oregon State Capitol and they put all of these tiles together to create a 125-foot salmon mosaic. That was in 2013. We've gone on to do these mosaics in our other states. So whale mosaic in Massachusetts. We most recently finished a manatee mosaic in Florida. And we are planning to do a national convening here in DC next spring, where we will create this huge national mosaic and be able to involve our federal level representatives and senators, and really giving our student leaders the opportunity to showcase their art, to tell their story, and to be able to advocate for climate policy solutions.
Yeah, I think telling their own stories is so powerful, and hearing those stories has such an effect on legislators and adult volunteers who are inspired by the youth in this movement.
I think you're spot on with that.
What do young people need from adult allies?
I feel like this is a question that I get all the time. And sometimes I feel like we as adults, we overthink it. I'd reword the question to say, what do we need from each other? We're all human beings. There's a certain magic when you bring together multiple generations. Think about the warm feeling you have when you see a story or a picture on the internet of a family and it's 3, 4, 5 generations. This is the type of feeling we can get when we work together intergenerationally. We're all bringing something to the table, from our upbringing to our education to our experiences and lack thereof. Young people need to know that adults are there for them. There's so much going on in this world. I personally am so glad that I'm not 15, 16 years old with a whole bunch of hormones roaming around in me, and I'm having to deal with, I'm trying to be this great climate justice advocate and the world is falling apart. That's a lot to deal with. And we as adults have had to really tackle that for ourselves this past year, dealing with the pandemic and every other issue rising up. Young people's voices need to be heard, uplifted, brought to the table, and part of the decision-making process. And my last gem would be that adult allies should be open to listen, but also open to share their mistakes. And that's what I hear a lot from young people.
Wow, Jasmine Sanders, Clara Fang, that was fantastic. And I love that last beautiful context, Jasmine, switching it from, what can young people learn from adults to we're in this together. I think that's a way more powerful way of thinking about working with people than, maybe one person has something to offer and another person doesn't. But thank you so much for that session. The two of you would really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Thank you.
All right, we'll be joined now by Dr. Danny Richter from the head of government affairs in our DC office in Washington, DC. Welcome, Danny.
Hi, everybody. Welcome here. Thank you for attending the June 2021 CCL conference. I'm very pleased to be here with you today, and I'm here to give you a legislative update. Much of what I'm going to say here I covered over the past 2 Thursdays on a couple of Citizens Climate Universities, or CCUs. These were both recorded and are available on Community. If you're interested, we also recorded the Q&A and made it available separately. I answered dozens of questions between the 2 webinars, so they may be worth your time to watch. The first webinar covered primary asks, supporting asks, and the current political considerations that we are making. In the second webinar, I modeled one way you might use our 2 auxiliary carbon pricing as popular documents, and I spent some time exploring some of the subtleties to border issues and carbon prices. While I covered a lot of ground and gave you a lot of ammo to use, please remember, the most successful meetings are not those where you say all the facts you've learned. The most successful meetings are those where you listen first and share only the facts you've learned that directly address what you heard the staffer or members say. Our goal is to have meetings with an even 50-50 split between us speaking and the office speaking, or perhaps better, a 50-50 split between them listening and us listening. So our primary asks this year all have a similar message. It turns out that the United States is only one of 2 developed economies that don't have a national carbon price. There are 34 other countries that have already figured this out. And note here that RGGI and California's cap and trade don't count because they are at the state level, not at the national level. Based on this insight, the core message to Democrats is, number 1, the United States is isolated on climate policy for our lack of a national carbon price. And number 2, Biden can't succeed in his international climate agenda because without a carbon price, other countries will view us as lacking seriousness and durability. What do I mean by this? I mean, we lack seriousness because among our peers, we are isolated by our failure to have listened to the experts who have said that explicit carbon pricing remains a necessary condition of ambitious climate policies. We lack durability because whatever one president does without Congress, the next president can undo just as easily. Now, for Republicans, this requires a very, very different message. Republicans and Democrats have a different worldview, so it requires a different message. And using the same basic fact that the United States is isolated among developed countries on this, the Republican message highlights, number 1, that failing to have a carbon price means that any country or union that develops a carbon border adjustment mechanism, or CBAM, stands to eat our lunch. And 2, carbon border adjustment mechanisms work to enforce good behavior. So what do I mean by eating our lunch? Well, countries or unions with a carbon price and a carbon border adjustment mechanism will collect revenues on carbon-intensive goods at the border from countries without a carbon price. They will use those revenues as they see fit. By contrast, if we had a comparable price domestically, it is likely that those revenues would have stayed here and we would have used them as we saw fit. This is because it's probable that 2 countries with carbon prices and carbon border adjustment mechanisms would rather declare equivalence in price between like goods rather than track all the variables such as currency fluctuations, shifting power supplies, and shifting supply chains it would take to rebate the revenue at one border and assess it all over again at the next border. Further, while we are focused in these primary asks on EU and Canada, once a country or union figures out how to do a carbon border adjustment mechanism, there's very little stopping any other country with a carbon price from copying their framework. This would include China, South Korea, and Japan, all of which have carbon prices in place right now, and all of which are among the 10 largest economies in the world. This is what I mean by other countries eating our lunch. What do I mean by enforcing good behavior? Here is I've seen and shared on those CCUs news reports that China and Russia are either deploying their existing carbon price more rapidly, in the case of China, or considering a carbon price for the first time, in the case of Russia, and that the reason for both these actions is because of the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism. A direct line is being drawn in the press between these events. And so that's what I mean by this being effective in enforcing good behavior. We have concrete examples unfolding before our very eyes. Now, all of this is background to set us up to make our primary asks in our meetings. Now, what are our primary asks? We've actually crafted 5 primary asks, and I'll go through them right now. For Republican senators, the ask is to help America compete, price carbon, and in the meantime, review the border carbon adjustment language in the Durbin, Coons, and White House bills. For Republicans in the House, help America compete, price carbon, and review the border carbon adjustment language in the Deutsch, Fitzpatrick, and Newman bills. For Democratic senators, the ask is to co-sponsor the Durbin or the White House bills. We expect the White House bill to come out next week. For Democrats in the House who are not yet a co-sponsor, we want them to co-sponsor the Deutsch bill, HR 2307. For Democrats in the House who are already a co-sponsor, there are 68 such Democrats, we want them to speak publicly about their co-sponsorship of the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, HR 2307. Now, we also have supporting asks available for you to use as you plan your meetings. The place where I expect supporting asks to be the most useful is with House Republicans. Generally speaking, they have the furthest to go on a carbon price and on climate action generally. So there's the most work to get them anywhere on the ladder of support for climate solutions. Supporting asks can help with that. I still want you to make the primary ask with House Republicans, just perhaps transition a little bit sooner to the supporting ask than you do in your meetings with Senate Republicans, with Senate Democrats, or with House Democrats. We have 5 supporting asks this June, and that's probably the most I would want to have for any lobby day. Now, why is that? Well, in my view, part of the logic of CCL comes from our large numbers of constituents asking for basically the same thing. If we have too many things we're asking for, we dilute the power of our numbers. So I like to limit our official supporting asks to no more than 5. This strategy is part of why we were so successful last Congress in getting the Use It Act, the BEST Act, and the Climate Ready Fisheries Act passed into law. For each of these bills signed into law by President Trump as part of the December COVID relief package, the month in which those bills added the most co-sponsors was the month in which CCL volunteers made their strongest effort on those bills. You have helped make bipartisan climate legislation the law of the land. The people on this call have helped make bipartisan climate legislation the law of this land. We've also seen this power at work already in this Congress, the 117th. We had the Growing Climate Solutions Act as a supporting ask in March before it was reintroduced. When it was introduced in April, it had 17 Republican senators and 17 Democratic senators on it in a rare and powerful display of bipartisanship. It now has 50 senators co-sponsoring it. 2 days later, it was reintroduced in the House on Earth Day with 10 Republicans and 13 Democrats. We helped create this rare example of bipartisan cooperation on climate for agriculture, and to such a degree that when Debbie Stabenow, the lead sponsor on this in the Senate, when Debbie Stabenow's office was referring a reporter to whom to talk to about this bill, she referred them to Ben & Jerry's Ice Cream and to Citizens Climate Lobby. This is even though there were over 50 farm groups, environmental organizations, and Fortune 500 companies supporting it at introduction. I take this as a sign that the lead Senate sponsor on this knows who did the heavy lifting to get this level of support. We can be, and we are, a force for bipartisan action on climate. This June, there are 5 official supporting asks, and you'll notice that each of them has a particular appeal to a different type of legislator. We hope that something in this variety will provide something compelling for everyone in our organization to bring to their member of Congress and to build your relationship with your member. Those 5 supporting asks are the Reclaim Act, which will be good for those who are in coal country. Again, as mentioned, the Growing Climate Solutions Act, which will be good for members of Congress who have a strong ag presence in their district. Third, we have the Energy Sector Innovation Credit Act, which is going to be good for members on Ways and Means or Finance, or those who generally are interested in either innovation. A lot of Republicans are interested in innovation on climate, or in renewable energy. Lots of Republicans are also very interested in renewable energy. And I will note with the Energy Sector Innovation Credit Act, this is the only one of the supporting asks that hasn't been reintroduced yet, though we do expect it, like the Growing Climate Solutions Act, to be reintroduced soon. Next is the Hope for Homes Act, which we think will help in progressive offices. And the fifth official supporting ask is the SCALE Act, which will be good for those offices that have an interest in carbon capture and sequestration. This is going to be a good thing, again, for Republican offices. Also, if you're looking at regions in the country, those with coal also tend to be very interested in CCS, as is our Wild West region. Members there are particularly interested in carbon capture and sequestration. So now let's cover some current political considerations. First of all, we really want Republicans supporting a carbon price, and we want it to pass via regular order with 60 votes in the Senate. We maintain hope for this outcome, and it is our ideal scenario. But we are also realistic about where we are at, and that this outcome has a low probability. There is a higher probability that we end up with a reconciliation bill. Such a bill is likely to be very big and to draw bits and pieces from other bills. While we maintain hope for a standalone carbon fee and dividend bill, and we are being very careful not to do anything to make that outcome less likely, we are also trying to act in ways that increase the probability that a reconciliation bill takes bits and pieces from a carbon fee and dividend bill. Standalone bills are likely to have bits and pieces incorporated into a bigger bill, so we're supporting those standalone bills, maintaining that hope while also improving the window through which that larger probability reconciliation bill with a carbon price can fit. We also believe that if we get bipartisan support for a standalone carbon pricing bill, that it would make it easier for moderate Democrats, particularly in the Senate, to vote for a reconciliation bill that includes a carbon price. It is also, fortunately, a part of our reality that important components of the politics surrounding carbon pricing are getting a lot better. Specifically, we're hearing a lot of support for a carbon price from unprecedented numbers of businesses, business associations, and small and medium-sized businesses. As Jerry Taylor mentioned earlier in this session, businesses are the core of the Republican identity, and the current deference to Trump, I believe he referred to it as not a stable equilibrium. Recent examples of businesses, business associations, and small and medium-sized businesses putting wind in the sails of a carbon price include the National Ocean Industries Association, which includes both offshore wind and offshore oil producers calling for a carbon price. Maersk, the shipping company, you may have seen their name on shipping containers if you've ever been near a port or seen a truck going by, calling for a $150 carbon tax on shipping fuel by 2030. $150. It's amazing. The U.S. Climate Finance Working Group calling for a carbon price. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce calling for market-based solutions to address greenhouse gas emissions. Carbon prices are a type of market-based solutions. The American Petroleum Institute calling for an economy-wide carbon pricing, and the American Chemistry Council also calling for economy-wide carbon pricing. This is in addition to the more than 1,100 small and medium-sized businesses that the people on this call have helped earn endorsements for the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. Second, we're also getting some constituencies who are important to Biden's coalition starting to hear some noise from labor. For example, the American Federation of Teachers, the largest union within the AFL-CIO, and one of the largest unions, top 3 in the country, endorsed the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. We're very excited to have their support. Finally, and perhaps most important, the international community is moving in compelling ways to listen to the evidence that has convinced scientists and economists that carbon prices are a necessary condition to solving the climate crisis. Most importantly, as already discussed, is the carbon border adjustment mechanisms that are starting to be thought through. Though the narrative is different for Democrats and for Republicans, we must pay attention to the different narratives that are required for those audiences while dedicating half our meetings to listening The pressure is the same direction for members of both parties towards evidence-based policymaking towards a carbon price here in the United States. And I don't know about you, but nothing gets me quite so excited on a Saturday afternoon as evidence-based policymaking. Thank you all for being here, and together, let's get it done.
Great. Thank you so much, Danny Richter. We'll start again in 10 minutes. That was fantastic, Danny. Thank you so much. All right.
Thanks, Mark.
Yep.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.